Welcome to POTUS 2016, where we call the presidential horse race and pour cold, hard facts on the overheated campaign rhetoric. On the eve of Martin Luther King Day, the Democratic candidates held their last debate before the voting in Iowa and New Hampshire. It was sponsored by the Congressional Black Caucus Institute. Things that the NBC moderators did not raise included voting rights, reparations, white privilege, racial conflict on college campuses, disparities in educational outcomes, and the recovery from the Great Recession that has left blacks much further behind economically than before. But one racial matter did come up: the criminal justice system.
Well, sadly, it's reality. And it has been heartbreaking and incredibly outraging to see the constant stories of young men like Walter Scott, as you said, who have been killed by police officers. There needs to be a concerted effort to address the systemic racism in our criminal justice system.
Who in America is satisfied that we have more people in jail than any other country on earth, including China, disproportionately African American and Latino?
Not much disagreement there. So, Bernie, why is Hillary leading among black voters by like 50 points?
When the African American community becomes familiar with my congressional record and with our agenda and with our views on the economy and criminal justice, just as the general population has become more supportive, so will the African American community, so will the Latino community. We have the momentum. We're on a path toward victory.
But if Bernie is black voter challenged, Hillary lags behind among young voters, being trounced by Bernie there 2-1. Explain that one, Madam Secretary.
Look, I have the greatest respect for Senator Sanders and for his supporters, and I'm going to keep working as hard as I can to reach as many people of all ages about what I will do, what the experience and the ideas that I have that I will bring to the White House, and I hope to have their support when I'm the Democratic nominee.
But will she be the nominee? Because Sanders is polling surprisingly well, Clinton has decided to both embrace President Obama and attack Bernie for, among other things, thinking he could replace Obamacare with a single-payer government system that would eliminate private insurance.
We have the Affordable Care Act. That is one of the greatest accomplishments of President Obama, of the Democratic Party, and of our country. There are things we can do to improve it, but to tear it up and start over again, pushing our country back into that kind of a contentious debate, I think is the wrong direction.
And there was another example of Clinton newly wrapping herself in Obama's flag when Sanders advocated breaking up the big banks before another too-big-to-fail financial crisis. Hillary managed to paint that as an attack on the president.
There should be no bank too big to fail and no individual too powerful to jail. We agree on that. But where we disagree is the comments that Senator Sanders has made that don't just affect me, I can take that, but he's criticized President Obama for taking donations from Wall Street. And President Obama has led our country out of the Great Recession. Senator Sanders called him weak, disappointing. He even in 2011 publicly sought someone to run in a primary against President Obama.
If the candidates, Democrats and Republicans, are getting more aggressive with each other less than 2 weeks before the Iowa caucuses, history suggests it happens every election year, and they are right on track. Yes, time for the horse race. In Iowa, the Donald Trump and Ted Cruz campaigns this week appear to be neck and neck. Current polling trends calculated by the Huffington Post show the trajectory of both campaigns leveling off and now colliding at 28%. Marco Rubio remains in the running with 13%. But the bounty of candidates that once seemed like an advantage to a grand old party seeking a moderate alternative to Trump and Cruz now looks, well, unhelpful. But there is a glimmer of hope for John Kasich in New Hampshire, where the Ohio governor has moved into a solid second place behind Trump. In a just-released American Research Group live interview poll, outsider Trump leads among likely voters with 27%, while insider Kasich grabs an impressive 20%. Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, Chris Christie, and Jeb Bush are running in a pack behind the frontrunners between 8 and 10%. On to the Democrats in New Hampshire. Bernie Sanders is feeling the wind at his back there in a close race now being described as a runoff between the pragmatic head of Hillary and the passionate heart of Bernie. According to the American Research Group poll, Sanders leads Clinton 49% to 43% among likely primary voters. Martin O'Malley's share sits at 3%. A recent CNN, University of New Hampshire, WNYR poll showed that this lead for Sanders comes at a time when the majority of voters, 52%, have now decided on their choice. That poll also showed that Bernie continues to lead the youth vote in the heavily white state with 82% of voters under 35 and about 2/3 of voters who have never voted in a primary. Back to Iowa, where polling trends show passion rising over pragmatism. That is, Bernie continuing to move up while Hillary falls. With less than 2 weeks to go, Clinton sits precariously atop a 4-point lead with 46% in Iowa and Bernie closing the gap at 42%. Before we get to our guests, just in case you missed it, the cover of the Daily News today, Wednesday, celebrating Sarah Palin's endorsement of Donald Trump. Donald defended New York values, and look what he gets. All right, time to discuss the issues behind the headlines. Joining us, Eddie Glaude, professor of religion and the African American Studies chair at Princeton and author of a brand new book just out this week called Democracy in Black, How Race Still Enslaves the American Soul. Welcome.
Glad to be here.
My impression, as I shared with the viewers of the debate, was that when it came to race, even though it was billed as an MLK weekend, Congressional Black Caucus Institute debate, was fairly shallow. Was that your impression?
Absolutely. I think particularly around education, particularly around the effects of what I call the Great Black Depression, specifically around housing and long-term unemployment, relative silence. And even around criminal justice, even though they were pretty close, no one talked about what was going on in Chicago with Laquan McDonald. I suppose Hillary Clinton couldn't talk about it given her friend Rahm Emanuel, but Sandra Bland. So it was there. Yeah, I thought it was a bit shallow, particularly because it was a CBC Institute debate. You would think that they would focus most of the debate on the issue of race, but they didn't.
I would have thought so too. Did you learn anything from what they did say in the debate on the racial issues, mostly criminal justice issues, that did come up? Any discernible differences between the two of them? Because they seem pretty close.
Well, I think the main thing is that Bernie Sanders seems to connect the criminal justice question to these broader economic realities that he wants to challenge. And that's refreshing. I'm always a bit weary of the traditional appeals to more community policing, to police training and procedures. My colleague Naomi Murakawa has written a wonderful book entitled The First Civil Right, How Liberals Built Prison America. And she talks about those very strategies that were part of the Clinton crime bill that has been a part of actually maintaining mass incarceration. So I think there's nothing new coming from them. We need something a little bit more dynamic, like decriminalization, that might help us.
For disclosure, are you a Sanders supporter, or are you officially for anybody?
I'm not officially for anyone. Although I must admit, I was on a train on my way to D.C. and was delighted to hear Sanders talk about Wall Street and talk about Goldman Sachs in the way that he did.
Have you heard the lines that the pundits have been using about Clinton hugging Obama so tightly in this debate that she broke a few of his ribs, that Michelle was getting jealous? What do you think she gets if the strategy succeeds? I guess it was targeted at the large black portion of the electorate in the Democratic primary in South Carolina in particular. Do you think Obama is still so popular among that part of the electorate that she might get something from that? I
think he's popular, but I don't know if that will translate in actual voting, right? Because at the same time that he's popular, people are dealing with the continued effects of the Great Black Depression, right? They're still dealing with unemployment. They're still dealing with a brutal rental market. They're still dealing with mass incarceration. They're still dealing with the housing crisis. So it's not just simply about a loyalty to President Obama that could be transferred over to Hillary Clinton. I think it's actually contingent upon concrete policies. What will she say to speak to the conditions of folk in South Carolina, around the country?
You used that phrase twice now, Great Black Depression. I know that's central to your book.
Yeah.
Why do you call it a depression when what we hear, the top line headlines about the economy is that it's recovering, today's stock market performance notwithstanding, and that, unemployment is down to 5%, things like that?
Well, black unemployment is twice that. Right, and it's at the levels in which we were screaming crisis during the height of the Great Recession. Even though it's not 16%, it's still hovering around 9.6%, if you correct for the holiday hiring. 240,000 homes lost. The wealth gap increased 13 times, white wealth 13 times that of black wealth, almost the largest we've seen since we've been collecting that data. But more importantly, 38% of African American children are in poverty. 38%. So this is not just an event for now, it's a generational event. So when we look at much of the vital statistical data, Black America is suffering. We usually say in our community that when white America catches a cold, we catch the flu. Well, this sounds more like a congenital disease than just the flu. And so folks are talking about recovery, but we're still catching.
So this is after 7 years of our first black president. How much do you blame Obama for any of that?
Well, I don't blame him for it. I mean, he came into office with an economy that was in shambles. But I do hold him accountable for not being bold enough and direct enough to address the specifics of the devastation. Many people say, well, after the second year, Republicans came into office, he had to curtail his agenda. I'm thinking after they came in office and the Berlin Wall goes up in effect, he should have been even bolder. He should have been even bolder. So part of Hillary Clinton's gambit is that somehow black voters are just loyal to the black president. But I think in this particular election cycle, I think we're going to be looking for something much more substantive. And the Democratic Party is going to have to do much more than just simply say, we want to continue a third term of President Obama.
Right. And just from your own point of view, when you say he could have done things that were more bold, even after the obstructionist Republican majorities in both houses were elected 2 years in, now he's making news for doing everything he can through executive action to work around Congress on immigration, on climate, on other things. As you know, just this week the Supreme Court agreed to hear a case that challenges his executive action and whether he's going too far under the Constitution. So he would say, Professor Glaude, look, I'm doing everything I can.
Right, for everyone else. Right. This is for a constituency that voted for him at 90 to 95%. In 2008 and 2012. And when this constituency comes to him and say, look, this is what's happening in our community, the response is, I can't be the president of black America, I have to be the president of all America. And we didn't ask you that, right? We're asking as a constituency that has voted at this rate, what can you do to speak to the question of long-term unemployment? What can you do to speak to the question of the housing crisis and the like? And so at that point, it's not about whether or not he's black enough or whether or not he's actually interested in the black community in this sense. It's just whether or not you're concerned with justice in the most vulnerable.
So are there other executive actions he could take that are race specific?
I just wish he would have, maybe if he would have took up the agenda of the Progressive Caucus that really spoke to the most vulnerable and the most marginal in this country, just took it up as his own, we might have seen some movement. The main thing I think, Brian, is that I would have loved for President Obama to have changed the frame, Instead, he kind of played pragmatically with the game, as it's currently constituted. He was supposed to be a transformative president. I wish he would have been.
You've called for a blank out, is your phrase, at the voting booths this year. Want to explain it?
So the blank out campaign comes from my favorite novel, one of my favorite novelists, Jose Saramago, who wrote a wonderful novel, Seeing. And it's based upon this idea that the voters turned out in record numbers, and when they went to count the ballots were blank. 80% of them were blank. And it was a kind of bloodless revolution. It was through the democratic process, the voters said, these aren't our choices. These choices don't reflect what we think our government should be. So political scientists for decades have talked about African Americans as a captured electorate. that the Democratic Party just herds us to the polls, or at least attempts to herd us to the polls every 2 to 4 years, with no promise of delivering on policy. And so what we've seen is we vote at 90%, 95% for Democrats, but we still see the effects of the Great Black Depression. So what I'm suggesting in 2016 is that we turn out in massive numbers without President Obama on the ballot, but we vote down ballot. We affect local elections, county elections, state legislatures, gubernatorial seats, congressional elections, but leave the presidential ballot blank. Now, I wrote that when Hillary Clinton and Jeb Bush were projected to be the presidential nominees for the two parties. So I'm really afraid to suggest it now, but we need to do something dramatic, Brian, because whatever this is, even as you keep track of the horse race, whatever it is, it ain't democracy in my view.
Now, Trump obviously scares you, and Cruz obviously scares you more than the other Republicans, more than Jeb Bush, as you were just saying. You're a professor of religion as well as chair of the African American Studies Department at Princeton. How do you understand religious people getting behind a Ted Cruz in the way they are and behind Donald Trump in the way they are? You know, Trump gets up there and he curses. He's been married 3 times. Cruz, you know, he's got this harsh, punitive, bomb them to oblivion, the sand is going to glow in the dark. I mean, that's not the first kind of language I think of with respect to Jesus Christ.
Yeah, but you know, remember Ronald Reagan and the moral majority? Divorced Ronald Reagan, Jerry Falwell endorsing it. Remember George Wallace? Right? White Christians enjoy it. Remember Dr. King's letter from the Birmingham jail? That's really an indictment of Southern Christians, Southern ministers. And so there's a sense in which Christianity in the United States, it's been complicated by the issue of race. You know, Howard Thurman says of slaves, the great theologian said of the slaves, he said, they dared to redeem the religion profaned in their midst, because he saw white Christianity as a form of idolatry, right? So there's a sense in which Christian principles have always, in interesting sorts of ways, in this country have been reconciled with the belief that white people are valued more than others. But I think more importantly than that, or in addition to that, Brian, folks aren't just religious. They're also workers. And what we see in the South, we see working class folk and working poor people trying to figure out why their wages have flatlined, why their homes are no longer valuable, why the rental market is so brutal, why their 401ks have been devastated. And they're trying to figure out, I'm white, hey, I'm supposed to get the benefit of the doubt, but they're as vulnerable as any other so they're scapegoated. And Trump is playing into those fears, Cruz playing into those fears.
So stay right here, because we're going to bring in some additional evidence right on that point, and then we're going to bring you back.
Got it.
Time for evidence-based politics, where we meet a scholar who has studied an issue oversimplified by campaign rhetoric. Our current unemployment rate, as low as 5%, can be deceiving. Even with a job, a life out of poverty is not guaranteed. In 2013, the Bureau of Labor Statistics put the percentage of poor people who are working at 23%. And a new study using 2012 data and an alternative set of measures finds that a majority of people who are living in poverty actually are employed. Here to explain on Skype from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, is Brian Lehrer, Assistant Professor of Sociology at Louisiana State University. Hello from New York, Professor. Thank you for doing this with us.
Thanks for having me.
So the standard definition of poverty for a family of 4 is $24,000 of income a year. Do you dispute that basic definition of poverty, at least for that size family, and come up with a different number?
Not necessarily. In our study, what we tried to do was evaluate different measures of poverty among workers, right? So we tried to define work and poverty in a number of different ways, including using the official poverty threshold, as well as alternative thresholds, such as 125% of the official threshold, 50% of median income, and so on and so forth. So what we're trying to do is shift the focus from just looking at income-based poverty to distinguish between the workers and non-workers among the poor.
Is it too simple a measure what the federal government uses to define a working poor people? I believe they say people who spend 27 weeks or more in the labor force in a year but manage to stay poor. Is that too simple a measure?
By some accounts, yes. So what we tried to do was evaluate the implications of different assumptions such as that for estimates, right? So we could ask questions such as, do we want to consider anyone who worked just a single hour throughout the year in our population of workers, or are we only concerned about full-time, year-round workers who fall into poverty? Our results show that our answer to that and the assumptions that we make affect estimates widely.
You take into account 126 different sets of measures to calculate the percentage of the working poor. Can you tell us one or two or a range of those types of measures that we don't usually think about?
Yeah, so we considered a number of different questions, including what I just said in terms of the number or hours of weeks, or the number of hours or the number of weeks that someone needs to work in a given year to be considered a worker. We also considered whether we should include anyone who works, or we should only be concerned with heads of families who are ostensibly responsible for the well-being of others, versus including all workers, which would include teenagers and college students working part-time and potentially making below poverty earnings. So we addressed a number of those questions, and depending on the answer to each of those questions, we came up with one of those 126 different measures.
Eddie Glaude, do you want to add to this or ask the professor a question?
So how might your data affect the discourse on poverty in the country? So people think of poor people as lazy, as kind of taking advantage, gaming the system, remember going out to buy shrimp and lobster and all of this other stuff. So how might this study, right, impact the way in which we think about poor people in this country?
Yes, this is a great question. This is the motivation for our study. As you said in the intro, a majority of poor adults aged 18 to 64 fall below the poverty line. A majority of them who fall below the poverty line are working, right? And even those who are not working full-time want to work full-time, right? So they're underemployed involuntarily. They would like to work more if they could, which suggests that it's not about kind of idleness or unemployment. It's about the ability of people to achieve upward mobility through work, which isn't happening for a lot of Americans today.
Wow, I mean that's amazing. That's amazing.
It is amazing. So when we start to talk about policy prescriptions, an obvious one that comes up first in most people's minds is the minimum wage. Is that where you would start, and where else would you go? Because a lot of people couldn't even mention one other because there aren't many things in the media very much.
Sure. The minimum wage is one potential policy prescription. According to some estimates, I think by the Congressional Budget Office, increasing the federal minimum wage to $10.10 would lift 900,000 people out of poverty. Reducing it only to $9 would still lift about 300,000 people out of poverty. But there are other potential solutions. If we're concerned with kind of the individual level, we could think about job training that would improve workers' skills and allow them to be more likely to fill the jobs that are open today. And then we can also think kind of structurally, right? So we can think about the increasing use of contracting and subcontracting, which has fractured the relationship between employees and their employers. And research has shown that that's associated with reduced job security, reduced wages, increased likelihood of violations of labor regulations, right? So from a policy perspective, we could think about how to potentially enforce or provide more oversight for those type of contracting relationships.
Dr. Glaude earlier was talking about his framing of the Great Black Depression in his book, and you heard some of the stats he was giving economically especially and educationally, black compared to white in this country. I see you also in your study took into account racial differences and also racial and social risk factors for poverty. Did your numbers come pretty much, out the same as his?
Yes, according to our favored measure, non-Hispanic white workers, approximately 6 to 7% of non-Hispanic white workers fall below the poverty line. In contrast, between 16 and 19% of non-Hispanic black workers fall below the poverty line, and between 19 and 22% of Hispanic workers, which is pretty a stunning disparity. The other interesting thing that we find is that regardless of the definition that we use, we find those disparities, which suggests that definitions and the measurement debates don't really matter much in terms of finding evidence of important disparities.
So do you think that kind of racialized poverty is what stands in the way of the country actually mobilizing to respond to what your data suggests? I mean, what's blocking the political will here in your view? The racial disparities, that's a really kind of complex question that we don't get into in our analysis. I mean, there's considerable research that suggests that evidence of racial discrimination in the labor market, which would get to this, and other kind of structural conditions that might limit certain job opportunities.
I'll ask you the question you just asked him. What do you think is blocking that progress?
Well, I think the poor are kind of mapped as black and brown. And I think as long as they're seen in that way, they're seen as people who don't have the will and fortitude, and in some ways have made the choices that have landed them where they are.
So the classic American tradition of an undeserving poor.
Exactly.
And the ease with which white America labels black and brown people undeserving compared to themselves.
But and even you have folks like Charles Murray, right, beginning to map that kind of analysis onto white poor people in interesting sorts of ways, that they are taking up a similar kind of culture of poverty, a culture of pathology that's resulting in their condition.
Is that some of what we're seeing in the popularity of Trump?
Perhaps. And it's odd.
Because I've read that the base of his support is not actually the poorest, most depressed, heroin-addicted, suicidal, 45-plus year-old white people. It's one rung above that.
Right.
And they're really angry at those on that bottom rung who are their neighbors and are white.
And when you look at North Carolina and the Forward Together movement with Reverend William Barber, you see among that coalition poor whites from Appalachia, poor whites out of the Blue Mountains, organizing with them to try to change the conditions. So perhaps this is right.
Professor, last thought from you in our last 30 seconds. Do you see the issues being addressed in the campaign beyond minimum wage?
I think that we see the kind of dissatisfaction of the working class or the former working class come out in the election a lot. We do see a lot of discussion about the condition of working America, although I'm not sure that I've seen too many really kind of coherent policy prescriptions from any of the candidates that address this question in particular.
Thank you very much to both of you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
That is POTUS 2016 for this week. Less than 2 weeks to go to the Iowa caucuses, less than 3 weeks to the New Hampshire primary. Join us again next week at the same hour when we will be calling the presidential horse race and throwing more cold, hard facts on the overheated campaign rhetoric. I'm Brian Lehrer. Thanks for watching.